Okay, we are back here for our third and final installment of the topic of religious experience. And right now we're going to be looking at an article by C.D. Broad, a Cambridge philosopher that passed away now, but this is from his book, The Argument from Religious Experience, published in 1953. And Broad is going to be arguing for the perspective that we're calling the strong justification for inferring objective reality from subjective religious experience. So he sets out this analogy, comparing religious experience to music. Now, in relation to music, people can have different levels of relationship. You can have someone who's tone deaf, someone who appreciates music as kind of a fan. You can have those who have a fine-tuned ear. These are like, the people who would have season tickets to the opera and can tell you all the musical stuff that's going on. And then at the top level, you would have the composers, the people who actually write the music. These are the geniuses like Beethoven, Bach, or if you will, Hendrix and Cobain. All right. Now, in the same way, you can apply that analogy to mystical and religious experience. You have those who have no religious experience. You have those who are the ordinary followers. You have the particularly holy people or saints, and then finally you've got like the geniuses, the founders like Christ and Buddha, and folks who really have contributed to the field of religion. And so you can kind of match these up. So a tone-deaf person is sort of like the person with no religious experience. Now, when it comes to the tone-deaf people, like if you had someone who was completely tone-deaf and had zero appreciation for music, if those people were to walk around criticizing the people who are real music fans, we would think of that person as kind of uncouth or Philistine, as we might call them. That they're walking around bad-mouthing music fans and saying that why are you wasting your time on music? It's completely useless, and you should be enlightened like me and just realize that all music is essentially a pointless discipline. And what Broad says is we can make that same argument in terms of religious experience, is that those who have no religious experience whatsoever really don't have a place to criticize those who have significant religious experiences. And it would be just as distasteful for those without religious experience to badmouth those who have had it. So, however, he also acknowledges that one's capacity for religious experience is no guarantee of intelligence. Then he goes on to look at religious experience itself, and he's asking the question, is there some kind of common nucleus of religious experience that crosses time and race and religion? And he says that, well, yes, there does seem to be that, although the tradition will affect certain aspects. It'll affect the interpretation of the experience, and it will affect some of the details of that experience. So someone in a Muslim country is not very likely, and someone who practices the Muslim faith is not very likely to have a vision of the Virgin Mary. And likewise, Christians don't tend to have visions of Shiva or Kali. The mystical experiences or visions that people have tend to be contained to their own tradition. So, Christians can say, well, I heard the voice of Jesus. Or a Muslim would say, I've seen an angel from Allah that's giving me guidance in my life. Two more analogies that Broad makes to compare religious experience and to ask this question of how true or untrue is religious experience. He says, on the one hand, those having mystical experiences could be like hardcore alcoholics or drug users, people who are so enthroned in their addiction that they are beginning to hallucinate. Folks on drugs are seeing things, and it's delusion. And we would say that, if someone dropped some acid and then said that they could see God, chances are we would say, okay, that guy's not really seeing God, he's just tripping right now. So we'll go ahead and ignore them. It's the kind of information where we'd think, okay, if it was true, then all of us could see that, but all of us can't. So we generally say when someone's tripping or really drunk and seeing something, we say, okay, that person's just hammered right now. But on the other hand, you've got someone like a microscopist, someone who's trained to see things that the rest of us can't see. Um, if we had the proper training and the proper equipment, we could see what they see. So, we might not be able to see an amoeba or a paramecium, but if we had a microscope and we knew how to use it, we could see these things. So the question becomes: are the mystics, or the people who have religious experiences, are they more like people tripping on drugs, or are they more like microscopists or scientists who are trained to see something that the rest of us can't see? Broad goes on to tell this story. He says, all right, imagine that you have an imaginary race of people that are blind. Say they're born without eyes. How would you try and describe color to a species that had no sense of sight? It would be really hard. Like, describe the color blue without referring to anything visual. So you can't describe that, but you can use that to describe other things. So you can say, well, I can't describe to you what the color blue looks like, but I can describe the room that you're in. So, and that's the kind of information that others could confirm by, even if they didn't have any sense of sight, they could walk around and then feel around and listen in the room for what they were talking about, and could therefore confirm, all right, yes, all right, there's a chair over here and a table over there. Okay, let's confirm that. So there would be ways of confirming this concept of sight to someone who had no sense of sight, and you couldn't describe color, but you could describe, okay, here's where the chair is, here's where the table is. And likewise, Broad says you can do that with these religious geniuses, with the religious founders. They can't describe this mystical reality that other people can't describe, but they can make worthwhile contributions to other fields, like ideals and ethics. A classic example of this would be the Golden Rule. You have it in the teachings of Christianity. Jesus said, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Likewise, within Confucianism, Confucius said, do not do unto others what you do not want them to do unto you. And it's really fascinating. You can kind of see the Golden Rule appearing again and again throughout the various traditions of the world. It's one of these things that comes up repeatedly. And Broad is saying, well, this is an example, sort of like a seeing person describing the furniture in a room to a blind person. This is one of these spiritual geniuses describing the ethical and spiritual reality in which people live to those who don't have the same kind of spiritual faculties that they do. He mainly holds up ethics as an example of that. And they make worthwhile contributions to the field of ethics, like the Golden Rule. At the end of the day, Broad acknowledges that we can't use this idea of religious experience to prove or disprove the ultimate existence of spiritual reality, but he tends to definitely lean in the direction of saying, we probably should listen to these folks. And there are protests to that. They say, well, these founders are not quite normal. They're kind of eccentric. They're odd, and you can certainly say that about the Buddha or any of the Jewish prophets. And like, well, how do we know that's not due to some sort of neuropathic symptoms? They're not mentally ill in some way. It's how Broad responds to that is by saying, well, if you look at many of these geniuses, they are of sound mind and body, and yes, they are eccentric. But did you ever stop to think that maybe they're the normal ones and we're not? And as Martin Luther King said, it's not a bad thing to be maladjusted to a sick society. And Martin Luther King, he advocated for the creation of what he called the International Association for the Advancement of Creative Maladjustment. Sort of a mouthful, but if anybody feels so inclined to start such a group, sign me up. Sounds like fun. And these sorts of religious experiences are bound to produce abnormalities in people because, well, it's just the kind of stuff that you don't see every day. Finally, another objective to which Broad responds is that, well, how do we know that this isn't just coming from tradition of some kind? How do we know that these aren't just ideas that folks are accepting because they're passed on by their parents or their teachers or their clergy? And they could be based on false or misleading beliefs. How would we know? And Broad says, well, don't we do that with other things too? We go to school as kids and we learn all about science. We learn all about other disciplines that likewise are passed on through tradition. We learn these things from our parents and our teachers about mathematics, about science, about English and writing. We go to school and we learn this stuff. How do we know that that's not based on false or misleading information? And if you look at the history of science, yeah, at one point it made sense for Aristotle to think that vermin were produced out of dung. At one point it made sense to think that the world was flat, but we found out later that, these beliefs were false, and we've disproved that, just like we're doing now with quantum mechanics and other interesting fields in the development of science. But that hasn't caused us to doubt the entire scientific enterprise. And so just as we continue to have faith in that, Broad is saying, well, it makes sense then to continue to have faith in the spiritual enterprise of humankind, that here as people are growing and developing and putting out these ideas, well, there's an element in which these are trustworthy. And so that those who have these experiences, well, maybe they're worth listening to, and maybe we would do well to listen to that. So that's the strong justification. We already looked at Freud arguing for no justification, and James arguing for weak justification. Again, these commentaries, I'm putting these out there to help you with your reading during the week. It's not meant to replace your reading. You still got to read these articles, contribute to the discussion, and hand me your papers by Friday night. And again, if you have any questions, be sure to post that in the Ask the Professor section. I try to check that as often as I can. And as always, remember, there's no such thing as a stupid question, and if you can't be good, be careful.